The microfiche reader hummed in the basement of the Millbrook Public Library, casting a sickly blue glow across Daniel Porter's exhausted face. October 1999 had brought an early frost to Ohio, and the library's ancient heating system clanged periodically, a metallic heartbeat that punctuated his research. For 3 days, he'd been scrolling through newspaper archives from 1987, watching the town's descent from pastoral normalcy to national nightmare unfold in yellowed headlines. Third body found in cornfield. Millbrook murders. Police seek video store employee. Death toll rises to 7 as fear grips Ohio town. Daniel rubbed his eyes and reached for his 4th cup of coffee, now cold and bitter as the story he was chasing. At 24, he was the youngest reporter at the Cleveland Tribune, hired more for his willingness to work for nothing than any particular talent. His editor, Jim Garrison, had given him this assignment as a throwaway piece for the Halloween edition, a retrospective on the murders that had inspired the Harvest Moon Killer franchise, now 4 films deep with a 5th in production. What should have been a simple puff piece had become an obsession that kept him driving the 90 miles to Millbrook every morning before dawn. The librarian, Mrs. Chen, appeared at his shoulder with practiced silence. She was one of the few residents willing to discuss the murders, perhaps because she'd moved here afterward, missing the raw trauma that had scarred the original witnesses. "Found something else," she said, sliding a manila folder across the desk. "Was misfiled in the high school yearbook section. Thought you might find it interesting." Inside were photographs that had never made the papers. Crime scene photos, somehow donated to the library's historical collection, showing not the bodies, those had been carefully cropped out, but the elaborate staging around them. Each victim had been positioned with video cameras, old VHS camcorders, arranged like an audience. The killer, Thomas Brennan, had been documenting his work, creating his own twisted cinema. But these photos showed something the movies had never captured: the meticulous care, the almost loving attention to composition. This wasn't the work of the slavering madman portrayed by actor Jake Morrison in the films. This was something more disturbing, deliberate, artistic, purposeful. Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he made notes. The first Harvest Moon Killer film had premiered in 1991, just 4 years after Brennan's execution. It had transformed him into a supernatural boogeyman who returned from the dead each Halloween, sprouting corn stalks from his victims' wounds. The sequels had grown progressively more outlandish: demonic possession, cursed farmland, ancient Native American burial grounds. But the real Thomas Brennan had been a 22-year-old video store clerk who lived with his mother and spent his evenings making amateur horror films with a second-hand camera. The phone booth outside the library still worked, a minor miracle in the age of emerging cell phones. Daniel fed it quarters and dialed his editor. "Jim, I need more time on this. There's something here, something nobody's reported." Through the static, he could hear Garrison's sigh, the sound of a man who'd heard this from too many young reporters chasing their Watergate. "Kid, it's supposed to be a fluff piece. 500 words on how the town's doing now, maybe interview some locals about the movie money. That's it." But Daniel couldn't let it go. He'd driven to Millbrook expecting to find either tragedy or commercialization, the two standard narratives for towns touched by violence. Instead, he'd found silence. Not peaceful quiet, but the oppressive silence of held breath, of words swallowed before they could escape. The town had taken Hollywood's money, location fees for the sequels, residuals from tourism, but at a cost that showed in the residents' hollow eyes and quick departures when he mentioned Brennan's name. That evening, Daniel sat in his motel room at the Sunset Lodge, the same place where victim number 4 had worked as a night clerk. The current owner, Pete Kowalski, had bought it in 1989, getting it cheap for obvious reasons, he'd told Daniel with grim humor. The walls were thin enough that Daniel could hear the television from next door, playing the 11 o'clock news. The anchor was discussing the upcoming release of Harvest Moon Killer: Millennium's End, promising it would be the goriest yet. Daniel spread his notes across the bed, trying to find the pattern he knew was there. Brennan's victims had all been between 18 and 25, all involved somehow in the local art scene. Painters, musicians, a theater student home from Ohio State. The movies had portrayed them as random victims, interchangeable meat for the grinder. But Brennan's own videos, the ones police had found in his basement, suggested something different. He'd been documenting Millbrook's creative community, interviewing them about their dreams and ambitions. The murders had come later, after months of what Brennan had called in his confession, preservation. The knock on his door came at midnight, sharp and deliberate. Daniel opened it to find a woman in her 50s, wrapped in a wool coat despite the relatively mild evening. She introduced herself as Patricia Morse, Thomas Brennan's high school drama teacher. "I heard you've been asking questions," she said, her voice steady but her hands clutching her purse with white knuckles. "There are things about Tommy that never made it into the trial, things the town agreed to forget, and Hollywood never knew to ask about." She told him about the boy who'd been obsessed with documenting truth, who'd believed that conventional narrative was a lie society told itself. His final project for her class had been a video essay about how reality television, just emerging in the late 80s, would eventually consume authentic experience, turning every moment into potential content. "He was brilliant," she said, tears now flowing freely, "and that's what nobody wants to admit. It's easier if he was just a monster, but he was a brilliant boy who became a monster, and that's so much worse." After Patricia left, Daniel sat in the darkness, listening to the ice machine's periodic rumble. He thought about the 5 Harvest Moon films, their combined box office of over $200 million. He thought about the real victims, whose names were barely remembered, while their fictional counterparts died elaborately in dozens of different ways across the franchise. He thought about Thomas Brennan, who'd wanted to be a filmmaker, and had become one in the most horrific way imaginable, his crimes now fodder for the very industry he'd tried to join. The story was bigger than he'd imagined, stretching from a small Ohio town to Hollywood boardrooms, from real tragedy to commercialized horror, and Daniel knew with a certainty that chilled him more than the October wind that he was going to follow it all the way down, no matter where it led. The production office for Crimson Pictures occupied the 3rd floor of a strip mall in Van Nuys, California, a far cry from the Hollywood glamour Daniel had expected. He'd driven 16 hours straight after convincing Garrison to expense the trip, fueled by truck stop coffee and the growing certainty that the real story wasn't in Millbrook, but here, where tragedy had been transformed into commodity. The receptionist, a young woman with purple streaks in her hair and a nose ring, barely looked up from her copy of Fangoria magazine when he entered. "I'm here to see Marcus Volpe," Daniel said, and her expression immediately shifted to one of wary protection. Marcus Volpe was the producer who'd discovered the Millbrook murders in a true crime compilation and seen their potential. He'd pitched the first Harvest Moon Killer as Halloween Meets Henry, portrait of a serial killer, and built an empire on that foundation. After 20 minutes of waiting, during which Daniel studied the framed posters covering every wall, each showing increasingly elaborate deaths, the killer's mask evolving from simple burlap to ornate cornhusk nightmare, Volpe himself emerged. He was smaller than Daniel had expected, dressed in an expensive but ill-fitting suit, with the eager energy of a carnival barker. "Dan, right? Come in. Always happy to talk to the press about our little franchise." His office was a shrine to the films, with memorabilia covering every surface, prop weapons, costume pieces, and disturbingly, what appeared to be actual newspaper clippings from the original murders, framed alongside their fictional recreations. "The beauty of the Harvest Moon Killer," Volpe explained, gesturing with a cigar he never lit, "is the simplicity of the mythology. Small town, dark secret, unstoppable killer. We took the bones of truth and built something universal on top. That's what good horror does. It transforms specific trauma into communal catharsis." He spoke like he'd rehearsed this speech, and Daniel suspected he had, probably for film school students and genre documentarians who didn't ask hard questions. But Daniel had hard questions. He pulled out copies of Brennan's original videos, obtained through a Freedom of Information request that had taken 6 weeks to process. "Have you ever watched these? Brennan's actual recordings?" Volpe's smile faltered slightly. "Listen, kid, I'm in the entertainment business. What that sick fuck actually did, that's not my department. I take inspiration from reality, I don't replicate it." Yet, as Daniel pressed, showing him still frames from Brennan's videos next to scenes from the movies, the similarities were undeniable. Specific camera angles, lighting choices, even dialogue had been lifted wholesale. "You didn't just take inspiration," Daniel said quietly. "You took his vision and commercialized it. You made him the author he always wanted to be." Volpe stood abruptly, his friendly demeanor evaporating. "You want to know the truth? Fine. The families of those victims get a percentage of every film. Not a big percentage, but enough. Enough to send their kids to college, to move away from that God-forsaken town, to try to forget. You think they'd rather have purity? Rather have their loved ones remembered as real people who died horribly for no reason? Or would they rather have the money and the distance that fiction provides? The truth of it was more complex than Daniel had imagined. He spent the next 3 days in Los Angeles, tracking down actors, writers, and crew members from the films. Jake Morrison, who'd played the killer in all 5 movies, met him at a coffee shop in Silver Lake, his famous face hidden behind sunglasses and a baseball cap. "I studied those tapes," he admitted, stirring his latte obsessively. "Volpe made us all watch them before the first film. Said we needed to understand the authentic horror before we could recreate it. But man, the real guy. He wasn't scary, he was just empty, like there was nothing inside him but this need to record, to capture. The movies made him into something comprehensible, a monster. The reality was worse. He was just a void that consumed people." The screenwriter of the first film, now living in a rehabilitation facility in Pasadena, was even more revealing. Sarah Hendricks had been brought in to punch up the dialogue, to make the killer quotable and iconic. "The real Brennan barely spoke in his videos," she told Daniel, her hands shaking from either withdrawal or memory. "Just occasional narration, clinical and detached. We gave him personality, motivation, a backstory about abusive parents and rural isolation. We made him make sense. The studio said audiences needed to understand why he killed. But I watched those tapes, and there was no why. He killed because he wanted to film death. That's it. That's all." Daniel's motel room in Van Nuys became a war room of notes, timelines, and connections. The franchise had grossed hundreds of millions worldwide, spawning merchandise, fan conventions, and even a theme park haunted house. Thomas Brennan, who died in the electric chair proclaiming that his work would outlive him, had been proven right in the most perverse way possible. His vision, filtered through Hollywood's machinery, had reached millions. The 7 people he'd killed were footnotes in their own story, reduced to Victim Dust 1 through Victim Dust 7 in most articles about the films. But it was his conversation with Amy Chen, victim number 3's sister, that truly shook him. She'd driven down from San Francisco when she heard a reporter was investigating the franchise. They met at a Denny's near LAX, the roar of planes overhead providing a surreal soundtrack to their conversation. "My sister Michelle was a painter," Amy said, showing him a portfolio of vibrant landscapes, nothing like the goth artist portrayed in Harvest Moon Killer 3, Blood Harvest. She was planning to move to New York to study at Parsons. Brennan had interviewed her for one of his documentaries about young artists in Ohio. She thought he was harmless, maybe even talented. She let him into her life, and he took it. Mamie had taken the settlement money from the films, used it to open an art therapy center for trauma survivors. "I hate those movies," she said, "but the money does good now. It helps people. Is that selling out? Maybe. But Michelle is gone, and nothing brings her back. At least this way, something positive comes from the nightmare. The flight back to Cleveland gave Daniel time to process what he'd learned. The Harvest Moon Killer franchise wasn't just exploitation. It was a complex ecosystem of trauma, commerce, and storytelling that implicated everyone it touched. The films had made Millbrook infamous, Brennan immortal, and the victims forgettable. They'd transformed real horror into consumable entertainment, but in doing so, had also provided financial relief and emotional distance for those who'd suffered most. There were no clean answers, no clear villains, except the original one, who was 12 years dead but somehow still authoring the narrative. Daniel's apartment in Cleveland had transformed into something unrecognizable by November. Every wall was covered with timelines, photographs, and string-connecting dates, places, and people like a conspiracy theorist's fever dream. He'd stopped going to the Tribune office, filing his other assignments remotely, dedicating 18-hour days to unraveling the full story of Thomas Brennan and what he'd spawned. His editor, Jim, had stopped calling after Daniel had turned in a 30,000-word draft instead of the requested 500. His girlfriend Lisa had left after finding him watching Brennan's original tapes at 3 in the morning, taking notes on composition and framing. The tapes had become his obsession. He'd acquired all 43 hours of them through various sources, some legal, others less so. Brennan had documented everything: his daily routines, his thoughts on art and authenticity, his gradual progression from observer to participant in what he called the ultimate performance. Unlike the supernatural killer of the films, the real Brennan was methodical, intellectual, almost boring in his normalcy. He discussed his murders like a film student analyzing scenes, talking about emotional beats and narrative satisfaction. Daniel found himself thinking in Brennan's vocabulary, seeing the world through his lens. Walking through Cleveland, he'd catch himself framing scenes, noticing how people performed their daily lives unaware they were being observed. He started carrying a video camera, a high-8 camcorder he'd bought at a pawn shop, telling himself it was for documentation. But late at night, reviewing his footage, he recognized the same clinical distance that had characterized Brennan's work. The call from Patricia Morse, Brennan's drama teacher, came on a particularly bad day, when Daniel had been awake for 36 hours straight. "There's something else," she said without preamble, "something I didn't tell you before. Tommy had a partner, someone who helped him plan the murders, someone who's never been caught." The revelation should have energized him, but instead, Daniel felt a strange calm, as if he'd been expecting this. He drove to Millbrook in a trance, his camera on the passenger seat recording the journey. Patricia met him at the abandoned Millbrook Community Theater, where Brennan had performed in high school productions. The building was scheduled for demolition, its roof partially collapsed, water damage having destroyed most of the interior. But the stage remained intact, and on it, Patricia had arranged 7 chairs, one for each victim. He called it the final performance, she explained. The murders were supposed to be a collaborative art piece. His partner was meant to edit the footage into something transcendent, something that would reveal the truth about performance and authenticity. But after Tommy was caught, the partner disappeared with copies of all the raw footage. Daniel felt his pulse quicken. The tapes he'd been watching were police evidence, recorded over and degraded. But somewhere the original footage existed in full quality, along with material that had never been found. "Who was the partner?" he asked, though part of him already knew the answer would change everything. "A film student from Ohio State, Marcus Volpe." The name hung in the air like a revelation and a curse. Marcus Volpe, the producer who'd built an empire on the Harvest Moon Killer franchise, hadn't just exploited Brennan's crimes, he'd been complicit in them. The realization sent Daniel spiraling back through everything he'd learned, recontextualizing every interview, every denial, every carefully crafted story about discovering the murders in a true crime book. He drove to Los Angeles again, this time without telling anyone, his camera recording continuously. The 16-hour drive became a meditation on obsession, on the thin line between documenting and participating. He thought about Brennan's words from one of the tapes. "The observer changes the observed simply by observing. There is no objective documentation, only degrees of involvement." Confronting Volpe required planning. Daniel couldn't simply accuse him, he needed proof. He spent a week surveilling the producer, learning his routines, his habits, the rhythms of his life. It was, he realized with sick recognition, exactly what Brennan had done with his victims. The parallel should have stopped him, but instead, it drove him deeper. He was so close to the truth, to the real story that would expose not just a crime, but an entire industry built on blood. The opportunity came at a horror convention in Burbank, where Volpe was promoting the fifth film. Daniel had obtained a press pass, his camera rolling as he approached Volpe at an after-party in a hotel suite. The producer was drunk, expansive, surrounded by actors in monster makeup and fans dressed as the Harvest Moon Killer. Daniel maneuvered him onto the balcony, away from the noise, and showed him a photograph from Patricia Morse's collection. Volpe and Brennan together at the Millbrook Community Theatre, dated 2 weeks before the first murder. Volpe's face went white, then red, cycling through emotions before settling on something like resignation. "You don't understand," he said quietly. "Tommy was going to do it anyway. He'd already chosen the victims, done all his research. I tried to talk him out of it, tried to convince him we could create the same impact with fiction. But he insisted on authenticity, said anything else would be a lie." Daniel kept recording as Volpe confessed to knowing about the murders, to being present for the planning, to helping Brennan with his direction. But he swore he hadn't participated in the killings themselves, had tried to stop them, had only taken the footage afterward because he couldn't let Tommy's vision die with him. "The movies," he said, now crying, mascara from his monster makeup running down his cheeks. "They were my way of controlling the narrative, of making it mean something other than just senseless death." But Daniel wasn't satisfied with confession. He wanted more, needed more. He found himself pushing Volpe, literally and figuratively, backing him against the balcony railing 30 floors above Los Angeles. "Show me the original tapes," he demanded. "The real footage. You owe those victims that much." Volpe led him to a storage unit in North Hollywood, where in a climate-controlled room sat 7 film canisters, each labeled with a victim's name. Not numbers, not subjects, but names. Daniel's hands shook as he loaded the first reel into Volpe's projection equipment. What appeared on the screen was both exactly what he'd expected and nothing like it. Brennan had created something genuinely artistic and absolutely evil. A document of human beings in their last moments, unaware they were performing their own deaths. Daniel filmed it all, his camera capturing the footage of footage, creating another layer of documentation. He was deep in the maze now, no longer sure if he was investigating a story or becoming part of it. When he finally stopped recording, the sun was rising, and Volpe was gone, leaving only a note. "The story continues with or without us. We're all performers now." Daniel returned to Millbrook with the weight of truth crushing his chest. 7 film canisters sat in his trunk like unexploded ordnance, each containing evidence that would destroy the Harvest Moon franchise, send Marcus Volpe to prison, and finally give the victims' families the full truth about their loved ones' deaths. But as he drove through Ohio's flat expanses, he found himself questioning what justice meant in this context. Would exposing Volpe's involvement heal any wounds, or would it simply tear them open again, bloodier than before? He checked into the Sunset Lodge one final time, spreading his evidence across the same bed where he'd first begun to understand the scope of the story. His camera sat on its tripod, recording him as he organized his findings, creating his own documentary about documenting a documentary about murders. The recursive nature of it made him dizzy. He was trapped in a hall of mirrors that Brennan had constructed and Volpe had commercialized, and now he was adding his own reflection to the infinite regression. The families deserved to know, but when Daniel called Amy Chen to arrange a meeting, her voice was tired, older than when they'd met just weeks ago. "I saw the news about the fifth movie's box office," she said. "Another record breaker." Michelle would have found it ironically appropriate, her death funding art therapy for kids who'll never know her name. When Daniel hinted at having new information, she was quiet for a long moment. Will it bring her back? Will it make the movies disappear? Or will it just create more content for the machine? Her questions haunted him as he sat in Millbrook's town square, watching life continue around him. Children played in the park where victim number 2 had been discovered. The local coffee shop, owned by victim number 5's parents, served lattes to customers who didn't know or didn't care about the history embedded in the walls. The town had metabolized its trauma, transformed it into something bearable, if not comfortable. Would his revelation heal or harm? Patricia Morse found him there, sitting on a bench with his camera in his lap. "You look like Tommy did," she said, not unkindly. That same exhausted obsession, that same belief that documenting truth matters more than living it. She sat beside him, two people watching a small town pretend its most famous son hadn't been a monster. "I've been thinking about what makes someone cross that line, from observer to participant. Tommy crossed it literally, Marcus crossed it through complicity. Where's your line, Daniel?" That night, Daniel set up his camera in the motel room and began recording what he intended to be his final statement on the Brennan case. But as he spoke, explaining his findings, showing the evidence, demonstrating the connections between the real murders and their Hollywood transformation, he found himself faltering. The person on camera looked like him, but felt like a performance, another layer of artifice on an already impossibly complex narrative. He played one of Brennan's original tapes, then Volpe's film version of the same scene, then his own recording of both playing simultaneously. 3 versions of truth, each claiming authenticity, each fundamentally false in its own way. Brennan had killed 7 people to create art that revealed the performative nature of existence. Volpe had transformed those deaths into entertainment that millions consumed. And now Daniel was creating his own version, claiming the moral high ground of journalism while participating in the same exploitation. The revelation came at 3 a.m, as clear and terrible as Brennan's voice on the tapes. There was no outside position from which to tell this story. Every telling was a retelling, every documentation a performance, every truth a construction. The real horror wasn't what Brennan had done or what Volpe had made of it, but the infinite recursion of story and interpretation that made authentic representation impossible. Daniel found himself laughing, then crying, then laughing again. He understood now why Brennan had insisted on authenticity, even as he performed murders for cameras. He understood why Volpe had hidden his involvement while building a franchise on transparency. They were all trapped in the same paradox, trying to capture truth while inevitably creating fiction. He made his decision as dawn broke over Millbrook. Taking the 7 canisters and all his documentation, he drove to the abandoned Millbrook Community Theatre where Patricia had first revealed Volpe's involvement. The building stood like a tomb for the town's artistic ambitions, the stage where Brennan had performed now rotting, the seats where audiences had applauded now homes for pigeons and decay. Daniel set up his camera one last time, framing himself on the stage with the canisters arranged behind him. He spoke directly to the lens, explaining everything. Brennan's vision, Volpe's complicity, his own investigation, the impossibility of telling this story without becoming part of it. Then, methodically, he opened each canister and exposed the film to light, destroying the original footage forever. The evidence dissolved into nothing, taking with it proof of Volpe's guilt and Brennan's artistic pretensions. "This is my performance," he said to the camera. My choice to end the cycle of documentation and exploitation. The victims remain dead. The movies will continue. Volpe will keep profiting. But these specific artifacts of suffering will no longer exist to be discovered, analyzed, or transformed into content. He left the destroyed film in the theater and drove back to Cleveland, where he wrote a simple article for the Tribune, "The Harvest Moon Killer, a Town's Recovery, 12 years later." 500 words about resilience, community healing, and moving forward. No mention of Volpe's involvement, no revelation of hidden footage, no explosive truth, just a small town continuing to exist despite its history, and a franchise that would eventually fade when audiences found new horrors to consume. Jim Garrison published it without question, happy to have his reporter back from whatever rabbit hole he'd disappeared into. Lisa didn't return, but Daniel didn't expect her to. He'd crossed his own line, not into murder or complicity, but into understanding that some truths were too complex for revelation, too recursive for resolution. 6 months later, Harvest Moon Killer New Millennium was announced, with Marcus Volpe producing and a new director promising to return to the realistic roots of the original crimes. Daniel didn't cover the story. He'd switched to the Tribune's financial beat, finding comfort in numbers that meant exactly what they appeared to mean. But sometimes, late at night, he'd watch the footage of himself destroying the film canisters, the only remaining evidence of evidence, and wonder if his performance had been any more authentic than Brennan's or Volpe's. The horror franchise continued, growing more elaborate and distant from its source material with each installment. The real victims faded further into obscurity, their names forgotten, except by family and the occasional true crime blogger. Thomas Brennan achieved his immortality, filtered through Hollywood's lens into something both more and less than he'd intended. And Daniel Porter lived with the knowledge that he'd had the power to expose the full truth and had chosen instead to perform his own version of justice, adding one more layer to a story that had no authentic version, only an infinite regression of documentation, interpretation, and exploitation. The real horror, he understood now, wasn't the crime or its commercialization, but the impossibility of stepping outside the performance to show things as they truly were. Everyone was performing, had always been performing, and the only choice was whether to acknowledge the stage or pretend it didn't exist. Brennan had acknowledged it with murder. Volpe had acknowledged it with movies. Daniel had acknowledged it with destruction. And somewhere in Ohio, 7 families continued to grieve for people whose deaths had become content, whose lives had become backstory, whose truth had become impossible to separate from the fictions built upon it. The camera, Daniel knew, was always rolling. The performance never ended, and the audience, hungry for authentic horror, would always demand more.